During his first year at art school, war broke out, and Sapper Searle was called up, giving him no choice but to give up his formal training.
We were both called up, and in essentially an East Anglian division. And we were going around, mostly around different parts of East Anglia, not doing very much until the summer of 1940, when we spent a good deal of our time doing things like putting down mines and explosive charges in case the Germans, expecting the German invasion.
Despite being on active service, Searle continued to draw profusely.
I think the habit of keeping sketchbooks came to him during art school training, where it was obligatory. You had to submit one at the end of a term and so on. And he always kept a miniature one with him after that. And of course, with battle dress, there are lots of pockets and plenty of room for that. And thereafter, he always carried with him a sketchbook. They became numbered as War Sketchbook number 1 and so on in sequence.
Searle spent the early part of the war on training exercises throughout the British Isles. It was during a posting in Scotland that what was to become his most successful cartoon was born. He was billeted with a family in Kirkcudbright in the south of the country, whose daughter Cecily attended an Edinburgh school called St. Trinian's.
His ambitions just before the war had grown to the extent where he'd been hawking himself around London offices. But he did this for 2 years solidly without any great success. And then these little magazines started to proliferate as the war approached and indeed began, and he began to get the odd acceptance, and he was sending things. He sent some to his future wife. He didn't know she was, but Kay Webb received some and started to print them, although he didn't see, I don't think, anything seriously published before he went off to war.
In September 1941, 21-year-old Ronald Searle boarded a naval ship in Gourock on the west coast of Scotland and sailed to war. Events at home and abroad were gathering momentum. While Searle was at sea, unknown to him, Kay Webb published what was to be the first of many Ronald Searle cartoons in the popular magazine Lilliput.
He was very unlucky in that he arrived in Singapore just before Singapore fell. And it was, oddly enough, on the streets of Singapore, as it was falling, with the Japanese on the outskirts of the city, shells falling, smoke everywhere, chaos reigning, that he saw on the ground a fragment of a Lilliput magazine with one of his cartoons, a St. Trinian's one, the original St. Trinian's one, of the girls clustering around the notice board saying, due to the present circumstances, the match has been called off.
Enemy forces defeated in landing on the western shores of Singapore last night. Fighting continues.
On the 15th of February 1942, Singapore fell to the Japanese. And after only a month of fighting, Ronald Searle, along with thousands of others, was captured and forced to march for 3 days to the end of the Changi Peninsula, where he was imprisoned.
Early on in our captivity in Singapore, the Japanese quite suddenly ordered everyone to sign a form which solemnly declared that they will not under any circumstances attempt to escape. Someone discovered the hoard of forms that we'd all signed and stole mine back for me, and I sketched a couple of Japanese on it.
Searle continued to beg, borrow and steal his drawing materials throughout the war. Keeping his creative spark alive may have been what sustained him throughout the horrors that lay ahead in the years he was to spend as a prisoner of war.
His head was obviously full of images and full of a passion for observation. I think there was almost a compulsion there. I mean, it was the way psychologically that he survived those horrific experiences.
Searle was one of many thousands unlucky enough to be selected for forced labour on the infamous Siam-Burma or Death Railway. Searle and his colleagues made the miserable journey from Changi to Bampong in Siam by train. Hundreds of men died in awful conditions as they were crammed into metal carriages in oppressive heat for 6 days. Those who survived the journey were then forced to march almost 200 miles through inhospitable jungle before being put to work on the railway.
There were so many people dying at the time that you lost count. You just couldn't remember who they all were. Starvation isn't funny. And I used to spend most of my time thinking up means of stealing food. And after all, we were only stealing our own rations, which the Japs had taken over.
The men weren't just subject to starvation. Extraordinary acts of brutality and torture were everyday events. To have been discovered documenting such goings-on would almost certainly have led to summary execution.
The Japanese smashed his right hand, apart from sticking a pickaxe in his back, and seeing that he got beriberi and dysentery and Down syndrome and all these things. They smashed his right hand, but of course he was left-handed.
The thing that kept me alive was the fact that I was able to draw, and I wanted desperately to bring back a picture of what was happening, as there were no photographs. And not for one moment did I think that I wouldn't be able to come back and show this to somebody, to show exactly what did happen to my friends.
Searle lost many friends during his time on the Siam-Burma Railway. There was to be no respite when he returned to Changi prison, where he would spend the remainder of the war.
My experience was simply that I woke up day after day with the men dead each side of me. Eventually all my friends were eliminated, and most people I knew were eliminated. Very few of us came back. Many, many hundreds of thousands of us went up there. When they say that that railway, which was a considerably long railway, was every sleeper represented a body, it's absolutely true.
It is really quite impossible for somebody who wasn't in Japanese prison camps and to have the slightest idea of what it was like. One knows that, that one or two friends of mine who came back from there, it was a profound experience and one which they never forgot.
It was starvation, it was slave labor, it was every kind of disease, usually having 2 or 3 diseases at once. That was most of the men's experience. And a complete lottery with things like the fly-borne cholera that the men were suffering from. If the fly landed on your piece of food that day, that was the end of you.
The Japanese were terrified of getting cholera. And in about 3 bunks down from Searle, there was a bloke with cholera, was dying of cholera. He would put his drawings under the man's palliasse because he knew the Japanese would never touch it. And, you know, one's eyes fill at moments like this because he's a man suffering, but the art's terribly important. And it's not just important as a record, saying, well, you know, I'm going to die, and people will see what the Japanese have done. It was because he couldn't help himself.
Hiding their drawings amongst the dying was just one way in which Searle and the other artists among the prisoners managed to preserve their work.
We rolled them up, put them in a piece of bamboo, which would go into a bigger piece of bamboo, wrap it with gascate so that the damp couldn't get at it, put it in an old ammunition box, and we buried it.
Despite this game of hide-and-seek with his captors, Searle continued to draw, circulating his cartoons among his fellow prisoners. Even when he was gravely ill towards the end of the war, his output never ceased.
I do remember that there was nothing of him. It was like a baby or a monkey or something. He had ulcers in his hand, his drawing hand, and we thought he was dying, and we used to put him out, I say his friends, used to put him out each day on a ground sheet in the sun to sort of dry out or something. I don't know why, but one felt the sun would do something. He couldn't move, and there was no food, and he had dysentery, and we expected him each day to die. He was a tough little one, though. He wasn't going to. If you can imagine something that weighs 6 stone or so and has no qualities of the human condition that aren't revolting, calmly lying there with a bit of paper drawing a cartoon, then you have some idea of the difference of temperament that this man has from the ordinary human being.
Miraculously, Searle managed to return from the war with over 300 of his drawings intact.
The drawings are quite muted, but what they record is absolutely horrific. And of course his subsequent comments in the sort of publication of the drawings underlines quite how terrifying it was, the physical and the mental deterioration that he experienced and saw all around him. And when we look at those drawings now, we know that he survived, although many didn't. But when he made those drawings, he had no notion that he was going to survive.
If you look at the stuff that he came back with, the drawings from the prison camps and the drawings of Japanese, and compare them with the relatively simple sort of student-type drawings that he did for Granta, there's no question about it that he had matured.
He didn't allow the expression of much emotion. I don't think anyone who was in that situation did. They couldn't afford the luxury. And when they came back, they couldn't talk to anyone who hadn't been involved because it was so ghastly. You couldn't start to explain something that was beyond explanation. So his drawings were really his means of survival, his raison d'etre for having endured it, and the part of his apprenticeship as well. It's a very remarkable kind of combination of importances, I think.
Searle may have come back from the war half the man he used to be, but his ambition was, if anything, redoubled. And a lot of that ambition was to change the world, or at the very least the Britain he found himself living in. Celebrations at the end of the war were short-lived. The country had changed both physically and culturally. Times were hard, and with rationing increased, austerity was the watchword.
I think that after the war, people terribly wanted to put things together again. It's impossible for people who didn't live through that period to imagine what it was like. Half of London was in ruins. I remember my father taking me to the steps of St. Paul's. He'd lived in London all his life. And you look from the steps of St. Paul's, there were no buildings. It was just cellars with temporary brick walls to keep you from falling down them. Nothing. And with lives and cities shattered like that, people terribly wanted to go back to what it had been like and pretend it hadn't happened and reconstruct things.
Going back to pre-war Britain was not an option. Changing things, however, was. Even before the return of many of the servicemen, the people of Britain made a radical change when they voted in a Labour government by a landslide.
The Labour Party's great victory.
I think the whole thing was they didn't want to return to what had happened before, and that's almost certainly why the elections went the way they did. They thought we ought to have a fresh start.
When he was demobbed, Searle returned home to Cambridge, where his fledgling career still held a great deal of interest. With the help of his former teachers at the art school, he launched a well-publicised exhibition of his wartime drawings.
For him it was like, at 25, graduating from art school, which he never actually finished, and going out into the world with a portfolio. Of course, because he was assiduous and very committed draftsman, he had a lot of work to show.
To young Ronald's surprise, he had not been forgotten in London. In fact, the little packets of cartoons that he had sent off just prior to his posting overseas had continued to appear during the war in magazines such as London Opinion, and perhaps most significantly, Lilliput magazine.
His career really took off when he was sought regularly by Lilliput. He met his wife, Kay Webb, who's an art editor there, and between them, I think, because she was a writer and had plenty of ideas, he was propelled into an almost immediate set of plans and ideas for his future work.
Having found his niche at Lilliput and fallen for its art editor, his burgeoning career received another boost. Realising a childhood dream, he had his first cartoon published in Punch magazine. This success was swiftly followed by the publication in Lilliput of the second ever St. Trinian's cartoon, which he had in fact drawn while in captivity in Singapore.
There was a big market then for anything that was inventively drawn after the war, although there wasn't much paper, but whatever there was, Ronald was getting his fair share of space on.
There was, I think, a fairly rapid development of what you might call enterprising, adventurous journalism and media work. And it seems to me that Ronald's career took off as part of that really adventurous advance of newspaper, journal, and print media at the time.
Despite having been told by doctors that his wartime deprivations had left him infertile, the biggest surprise of the year came when Kay Webb, to whom he was not yet married, discovered that she was pregnant with twins.
Well, not having seen women for so long, he naturally went straight into the Society of Women, and it probably wasn't a great shock that he was very soon in a relationship and very soon after that married. And also the father of twins. Now that really was a shock and a kind of imprisonment, I think he always felt. Sounds hard on the twins themselves, but it was a bit soon for that after all that he'd been through.
If Searle had learned nothing else during his time as a prisoner of war, he had learned that his work, and in particular his brand of satire and irreverent humour, could lighten even the grimmest of moods.
The post-war period was one where Ron was only one of millions of people, particularly men returning from services, who needed to try to make sense of the misery of the things they'd seen and experienced. And sometimes villages or streets that came back to had vanished under bombing. So there was kind of subdued anger, which had been, I think, distilled in humour. And so you had examples of humour of the kind like we'd had Itmar during the war, but then we had the Goon Show and the whole madness of the Goon Gang. And that was a purging, I think, of anger. And there were young men suspended in time who were able suddenly to somehow crystallise the feelings about the world and try to, in a way, point the way to a new outlook.
People wanted fun, you know, after the war. They just wanted fun. It's the age, after all, of Ealing comedy, which people sneer at now, but I think is very much in the vein of Searle.
Well, there was a good deal of demand for more sophisticated humour, wasn't there? To some extent, it was an attempt to break with the kind of deferential culture. And I suppose what he was doing fitted into that mood very well.
I think it's fair to say that Ronald's politics at that stage were fairly standard soldierly politics, and the officer class, of course, had become very unpopular. And so, yes, there was a certain democratization of everything.
Recording his wartime experiences had improved Searle's draftsmanship. But this was not a time for high art or earnest commentary. The public wanted entertainment. Humour was something that could not be rationed, and in the grey post-war gloom it was his quirky cartoons that were paying the bills.